thought I'd tell you guys today a bit about some investigations that took place into a suspected outbreak of something called B virus, or simian herpes B virus, in some children in the Brong-Ahafo region of Ghana between 2010 and 2012. Now, in that 2-year period, some really quite prominent foreign and Ghanaian virologists, epidemiologists, clinicians got involved trying to work out what was going on with this outbreak. And initially in their investigations, they settled on this idea that whilst the kids' parents were off farming, that monkeys were coming down from this forest that connected all the affected communities. The kids were playing with the monkeys, they were getting infected, and that was that. Then some further testing suggested it probably wasn't B virus, and so they turned their investigations to consider some other animals and pathogens in that forest. Now, the whole saga is fascinating for a lot of reasons, not least of which because there's no monkeys in that area and there's no forest. But for 2 years, we sort of investigated it. So I thought I'd bring this strange and slightly dated piece of work now to you today, because I worry that sometimes when we think about misinformation in academia, we do think about these sorts of cynical charlatans and lazy dullards and all the rest. And actually, I think a lot of the time it's just us and the epistemic communities we belong to sort of maintaining these incorrect narratives without even realizing it. I should say that the people that were investigating that outbreak, Cambridge professors, US AMRID, all the rest, they were they're high profile, but they seemed genuinely also committed to doing the right thing. And I say this as one of the idiot epidemiologists that was standing there failing to notice the lack of monkeys or trees. So how that kind of worked very quickly is I'm a field epidemiologist sometimes, so I investigate outbreaks, especially outbreaks where we can't work out what the pathogen is. So I'll let you play with that.
Yeah, that's fine.
And whilst I'm doing that, I collect all our email chains, I document all our conversations. I do actually try and do my job of stopping the outbreak too, but I take lots of notes. So when I come back here afterwards, I switch to anthropologist mode, and I make these painfully detailed accounts of everything that happened and try and extract the actual scientific and epidemiological processes that we were playing out to work out how we could do it better in the future. Weirdly enough, this isn't the first time high-profile zoonoses outbreak responders have got the setting of an outbreak desperately wrong. So some of the most high-profile accounts of zoonotic emergence, when the backdrops were really interrogated empirically, they were found just not to have been possible. And so one is the 2014 Ebola outbreak in West Africa. At the time, and now even, a lot of people say that the area was primed for an Ebola outbreak because of deforestation and disrupting the bat habitat, so the virus spills over into people. It's a nice story. Some anthropologists familiar with the area were like, that doesn't sound right. And they were able to find old pictures too, and if anything, tree cover has actually increased. The same is true of something called the cut hunter hypothesis, which was perhaps the predominant sort of theory of how HIV got a foothold in humans in the 1920s. Historians went to absolute town on that, but it sticks around. Thank you. And it's a problem. These backdrops, they tell us the reasonableness of all the other components in our sort of explanatory narratives. The animals we're saying did it, the routes of transmission, the points of intervention or prevention. So it's not for nothing to try and understand how we keep doing this. I gave myself 3 tasks in trying to work out how we got this wrong. One was sort of working out where the hell this idea there was a forest came from and how we all came to believe it. The second was trying to work out just to what extent each of us genuinely believed there was a forest. Because, your first instinct is that somebody made it up. But, and then the third one, and I'm borrowing this slightly from the anthropology of rumours, not that this was a rumour per se, but when you're trying to understand a rumour, the most important question is to try and work out why that story was so damn good to tell for that group of people. Like, what made it a good thing to share? So a few more details quickly about that outbreak. It was late, I think it was like December maybe, 2010, and 16 children presented in the course of a week to this mission hospital in Techiman. And they had these really strange forms of seizures and paralysis, and very quickly the pediatrician, who happened to be a German nun that was working there, was like, this is something strange and bad. Called a local public health official, was like, yeah, I see that. Grabbed some samples. He knew a guy that worked in a really specialist virology lab in Accra, the capital, caught the bus, went down there, handed it to him, and this guy ran something called a multiplex PCR, which is essentially tested for lots of different pathogens. And he got a hit for B virus, which was big news because up until this point, it had only ever been described in East Asia. So, you know, everyone kind of wanted a piece of it, a newly emerging zoonosis from monkeys in Africa. So the national public health heads of the labs and everything, they decided to send a field epidemiology team to investigate. They went, they came back, they were like, pretty sure it's the monkeys in the forest. It was such a big deal and so odd though that they were like, we need some confirmatory testing. They reached out to the US Navy that has a medical research unit in Accra called NAMRU 3. They sent some samples to US AMRID in the States, didn't really work out. But in the interim, all these sort of foreign researchers and such also wanted a sort of piece and to help out. And so some confirmatory testing did happen at Georgia State, but it said, this isn't B virus, but it's possible that there's another simian herpes virus or something cross-reacting. So yeah, unfortunately, just the way things go, especially when you have these like slapdash response systems, is ethics approvals took long, funding proposals, other people had other bits of work they had to do, and it just sort of dissipated. And in the end, after 2 years, there was no good explanation and there was no intervention. Because of the time restraints, I'm really going to quickly, I won't tell you about how I finally worked out there wasn't a forest. The diamonds, the triangles, sorry, they're where the original 16 cases were from, and that's hundreds of kilometres. You'll see there's no forest connecting them. There are little bits of forest here and there, but a large chunk, about a third of the cases came from Techiman, which is one of the most barren industrial cities you'll ever encounter. Okay, so task one. Where did this idea of forest came from? As I said, I make these painfully detailed accounts of everything we do. This is a very simplified version. All you need to know is that each colour is a person in the response. The pink one at the bottom is Professor James Wood, if any of you know him, just putting that out there. And what you see here is where the dots are together, they're sharing information. So this is, over the investigation, how we were sharing information over time with each other. A lot of one-on-one conversations, you'll notice. Now, if I just look at where there was mention of a forest in our accounts, oh, sorry. Oh no, I've messed it up now. You can see that it started there and we all just ran with it. That was the field epidemiology team's investigation. And so when I talked to them all about it, they only had funding for 3 days of investigating. They only managed to go to 3 affected communities and speak with 3 affected families. They had it in their head that this was a laboratory-confirmed B virus outbreak, a monkey virus. So they were really just trying to locate the monkeys. So it just so happened that one of the dads, when he was being talked to, was like, you know what, a couple of decades ago, I think I might have seen a monkey on my farm. It just so happened that that village had some trees on the edge, and they were like, that's it then. The monkeys are in the trees, they come to the farm. Yeah, none of the parents reported seeing monkeys, but maybe whilst they're farming, the kids played with them. So I was able to work out who was sharing a bit with who at what time, because people were using different language to describe the forest. The field epidemiology team were always like, it's a forest belt, and then I noticed that the pediatrician kept referring to it as a forest area along this particular road, and I was calling it something else, and over time, other people we were talking to adopted different words depending on who they'd been speaking to. Now, the reason we were calling it different things, I've worked out, is despite the idea that there was a forest coming from one group, we all were convinced it was in different places without realizing. In fact, we were all imagining very different forests. And the reason we were doing this was because subconsciously we're implicating different monkeys. So the district officer was convinced there was a forest that went all the way from the top of Ghana down here because he thought baboons were responsible. And that would let the Morlaix National Park baboons get to Techiman. You can see the catchment area of the hospital is this road in light blue, which was where the pediatrician was sure the forest must be, because that's where most of the cases come from. The field epidemiology team were convinced that it was some Mono and Colobus monkeys from the sanctuary way off to the east. So their forest is essentially just like a third of Ghana. Wow. And despite, there were massive fights over which monkeys were responsible. The track changes of some of our research proposals are really mean. People being like, what the hell are you talking about? There are no Mono monkeys here. All of this. Wow. At no point did we work out we were all imagining different forests. Yeah. So, which brings me to the next question of, to what extent did any of us actually believe there was a forest? You can stand here and not know that there's the Khotan Countryside Reserve, like 10-minute cycle that way. It's possible to stand in Techiman and believe there is a giant sweeping forest somewhere just out of view. And a lot of the time in outbreak investigations, we don't see the pangolin sneeze on someone or the fruit bat drop a piece of fruit and then the monkey eat it and then someone find the sick monkey and care to it. We infer contact. So none of that's that weird. The bit that it begins to get a little tough was at the time I was in epi mode, like epidemiologist mode, not anthropologist mode, so I was not very sophisticated in my approach. I just wanted to understand how a third of our kids were coming from this city with clearly no monkeys, and yet monkeys were implicated. So I was just shoving Google Maps pictures in people's faces and being like, what the hell? And so the field epidemiology team explained, they're like, oh yeah, that's right. They were like, you know what, maybe the cases in the city aren't real cases. Maybe they're just getting caught up with this other outbreak. And so to them, they were able to dismiss them as just some aberrant data points in a smooth, quite short investigation. With the pediatrician, we were in a pub having this discussion, and she was like, oh, that's right, yeah, that's true. And so it was enough to throw her for a second about this conviction of the forest. But then she eventually came to explain it as maybe some human-to-human transmission. But I think if I'm trying to be very quick, what I'd say is that this idea of laboratory findings in the hierarchy of evidence just seems so strong that we were like, monkey-borne virus demands monkeys, which demands somewhere for monkeys to be. So no malice or confusion, just if we thought about it, we all knew, but we just didn't think about it that much. So final, maybe juiciest question, why a forest? Like, why was that what we imagined? And I mean, it's what we're primed to expect when we hear zoonotic outbreak in Africa, like through fiction, non-fiction, TED Talks, academic papers. The description of Techiman we were sharing with each other, despite a lot of us actually living there, looked a lot like what the CDC said Guinea looked like, rural Guinea for the Ebola outbreak, so people living in huts on the periphery of a forest and monkeys, rather than what Techiman actually looks like. And so it wasn't just that we were primed, though, for this image of zoonotic emergence in Africa. It was a colonial image of Africa we were holding all together. Like, there are other bits of this narrative which I haven't brought in about this idea about people lying, about not interacting with the monkeys because of superstitions and stuff, like really nasty sort of colonial creep there. But the reason I'm telling you all this strange story in a really abridged way is because none of what we do, even our like scientific experiments, are not in historical or moral voids. We don't operate that way. We sustain certain hierarchies in everything we do in terms of knowledge production, social relations, and it doesn't help pretending that anything we can do is clean or free of that. The full paper is there. It's a very strange story if you want to read it. And I'm going to end on some thanks, because the only reason I'm able to do the work that I do on these outbreaks is because my colleagues let me do it. I talk about our greatest failings, like really terrible stuff, like 30 dead children kind of deal, in great detail, and I publish it in peer-reviewed journals, and I talk to other people about it when we're all clearly identifiable. And it's not just that they let me do that, they give me the email chains, they give me the track changes, they like sign the waivers, and it's because they are genuinely committed to us doing our job better, which is not always the culture in scientific groups, I'm realizing. But if we can like, you know, bring in that kind of bravery and reflection and honesty, I think hopefully we can all do our work a little better. So that's it. I'm sorry if I went over.
That's perfect.
Okay, time for some questions. You have one.
I missed it, and this has nothing to do with what you were talking about. What was the cause of the outbreak?
I still don't know to this day, but I've got a lot of serosamples sitting in a -80, if anyone comes up with some good ideas. To be honest, I've got, this is not to do with misinformation, but I've got two main theories right now.
Yeah.
So one is that I think it might have been organophosphate poisoning, because it was or something similar toxicologically, because it was non-progressive permanent paralysis and a lot of epistotonus, so the bending back of the spine. Another thing, though this is like going a little off, and it's only because of some swine flu complications I've become aware of, maybe there was an outbreak in the area and it triggered an autoimmune disorder that attacked a certain part of the brain, because with swine flu, we saw autoimmune narcolepsy as a sequelae for some people. And then there's some discussions about nodding head syndrome and such too being similar mechanisms, which might explain why the kids were so scattered rather than clustered, as we normally like in outbreaks. And I didn't say this, and I don't say it in the paper, that part of Ghana every year reports 5 times the number of unexplained acute flaccid paralysis kids in children. The national incidence 5 times every year without fail. It shows up in the polio surveillance data, but it's not polio, they always test negative. So I think it's an ongoing burden of disease. It does look to have some seasonality with it, so maybe infectious, but again, no idea. Sorry. Yeah.
One more?
I was going to, sorry, I really appreciate your presentation, especially explaining some of the challenges and mistakes and those implications. My question was like, what was the role of local community, like people who had that like knowledge of like what was happening? Because we talked about it a bit at you mentioned the HPS session we had for students in Sweden.
Yeah, so this is one of the really interesting things because I work with the district officers there, and normally they and I, anytime there's an outbreak in Techiman, we're like, oh, it's the big freeways that cross it. Brings everything to Techiman because it's on 2 massive highways. And so that's normally the backdrop we give every outbreak. We're like, oh, the reason we've got this cholera outbreak is because of, you know. But weirdly, they, as well as I, like got completely sucked into this weird vision of Techiman. Like district disease control officers spent their whole lives there. But also weirdly, Kofi Boni, this incredible virologist in Accra, his proposals when we had to go through like science technical committees, when he was talking about this outbreak, he said that the big risk is tourism to the area to get to that monkey sanctuary could export the virus to the US and places. Whereas like the obvious threat is to other children in that area. Yeah. But even he had got sucked into what we call the emerging infections worldview. Yeah. This kind of narrative of export to the north from, you know, deepest, darkest Africa of dangerous pathogens.
Or even just to Kumasi, which is like right down there.
I know. Yeah, but it's weird that even we get sucked into these dominant narratives of our epistemic community, and sometimes we have to sort of slap ourselves out of them and be like, what the hell happened there? Yeah.
Wow. Thank you.
No.
Wow.
We probably have time for one more if there's another one. One more, go on.
I think like there's this kind of a blind spot, right, because of our predispositions and our opinions and so on, and like people imagining what Africa is, well, it's totally different. But in that chain of people who were reacting to that, you had local Ghanaian people.
Yeah, most of them.
How were they at the top of that kind of scale and they didn't contribute to the talk of the forest? Or
no,
like,
we all believed there was a forest, like different
even
forests.
them.
Yeah. So the guy that thought it went all the way from Mole, he was born in Techiman. No, it was a predominantly Ghanaian team, and the field epidemiology team, they were from like Accra and Kumasi, so they didn't really know Techiman, and they did check out the monkey sanctuary, so they might have had a slightly distorted sense of that area. I know.
Like you had to drive to the monkey sanctuary.
I know. And it does. And for the monkeys to have affected all those communities over like hundreds of square kilometers simultaneously in a week, like that's a lot of monkeys.
Urban monkey population.
You know what? There are actually baboons somewhere near there, and I got so paranoid about the potentially not, despite there being papers saying there are baboons in this like one sacred grove. I had to send a friend out there to go send me a photo of a baboon because I was so in doubt of the existence of any monkeys anywhere by the end. It's weird, but it happens, and it didn't just happen in that outbreak response.
Yeah, really important case study. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.